And now I'd like to introduce the woman that started it all 30 years ago with Dr. George Kozmetsky, Laura Kilcrease. She is joined by four luminaries that assisted in the founding of ATI: Glenn West, Carol Thompson, Lee Cooke, and Ray Smilor. Welcome to our founder panel, Laura and team. Come on up.
I think this is on. Yes, no? Can you hear me? Yeah, it's on. Thank you. Great. Well, good evening, everyone. It's so exciting to be here and to see... can you hear me now? Sorry, feel like I'm eating this. Shouldn't. Welcome. I'm going to start this evening by laying some of the background to Austin back in 1989 when this was started. It wasn't the 2.2 million we have here today. It was just over 400,000 people. The downtown skyline had a few tall buildings. We used to call them see-through buildings because 1 million square feet of empty office space was sitting there unused after the second oil and gas bust of the 90s. So as a consequence, we felt so strongly that something had to be done to change and diversify the economy, not just of Austin, but of Texas. We had the sixth most high unemployment rate in the country, I think it was, and several people came together, notably George Kozmetsky, who is truly the architect of what has occurred over the last 30 years, and said, we have to do something about that. One day I got a call from George. I didn't know who he was. I was an English person, having moved here just a short time before, running a company, and he said, I have an idea. Would you volunteer some time? And I said, well, of course, let's kind of do something to make a difference here. For any one of you who may have known George, that volunteer of a few hours a week quickly turned to 40 hours a week of volunteership, and more had there been time. And from that, in 1988, we then kicked off the incubator in 1989, and I think these people here with me have some very, very valuable stories. I'm going to start with Ray Smilor. Ray was the associate director of the IC² Institute and worked with George for a very long time. Ray, tell us what was going on, what was important.
Good stories, I think, have a power. This is a good story. And it's fun to talk about the origins of this. In the early 1980s, incubators were the hottest thing. They were panaceas. They could solve all economic problems. There was this hoopla around it that was maddeningly demanding. George was cautious. And he said, let's learn about this. So IC² was the first organization in the United States to conduct a major research project on business incubators. The Institute published a book in 1986, the first one on business incubators. The subtitle was Linking Talent, Technology, Capital, and Know-how. And the focus was, what did we learn that worked and didn't work, and why? When we got done, George said, you know what? Let's learn from that and start an incubator based on that research. I want to talk about 3 lessons quickly that came out of that was applied to the first business plan that George and I wrote for the Austin Technology Incubator in 1988. The first lesson was we wanted to make sure that all the stakeholders, everyone up here, were thoroughly excited, were thoroughly thrilled, but patient. Because with incubators at that time, the feeling was if you start an incubator on Monday, you'll have hundreds of jobs on Tuesday and Fortune 100 companies a week later. We knew it would take a little time because we were experimenting. We were trying things that hadn't done before. We were innovating. We knew some things wouldn't work, and we needed the stakeholders to be excited but patient. So we structured a 3-year plan, and as George approached each one and asked for funding, he emphasized, don't expect any results for 3 years. We were convinced the results would come earlier than that, but we wanted to make sure that the staff, the companies, the others in ATI had the time and the breathing room to build something unique and lasting. So managing expectations was a key thrust of that original approach and plan. The second lesson that came out of the research was that you needed a really good director who had a foot in academia, in business, who knew about startup companies, who was entrepreneurial and dynamic. We invited Laura to come to one of George's early meetings. Now, for all of you, early didn't mean 7 o'clock. It didn't mean 6 o'clock. It meant you were there at 5:30, because George was there at 5. And at 5:30, Laura came over, and we laid out the plan for her. We discussed what the possibilities were, the potential was. It all sounded great. We spent a couple of hours about the potential of this, and then we got around to the budget. And we said, we have a budget, that's the good news. The bad news is we have no money at all. And if you do this, you have to work for free, and we don't know when you'll ever be paid. She said, when do we start? We knew we had the right leader and entrepreneur to help launch and lead ATI. The third lesson that came out was George's passion for the University of Texas at Austin. We learned from the research that a university could be the nucleus, the center point, the powerful magnet that could propel ATI forward if it was structured appropriately. So from the very beginning, the University of Texas at Austin, we wanted them to know that ATI was a learning, teaching laboratory. That in fact, this could advance not just economic development, but could advance academics, could contribute to students, and thus the focus on internships and courses and research was always a fundamental part of what ATI was supposed to be and in fact became. I'll end with this comment. If there was a real three-eyed raven, it was George Kozmetsky. He understood, he respected, and he believed in the past. He acted in the present constantly to innovate, and he never hesitated to have a compelling vision that was based in practice and to convince others of the possibilities of that vision. That's part of the story of ATI.
Thank you, Ray. And I'd like to recognize the Kozmetsky table with his son, Greg Kozmetsky, and his grandsons here, Daniel and Aaron, who've come in from Dallas to make sure they're here tonight. And by the way, I would say each of those three people contributed as well. Often Greg flew me around the country in the plane at 4 in the morning, and Daniel and Aaron helped during summer to help the incubator. Let me carry on. Glenn, from the Chamber's perspective, you were chair of the Chamber at the time. What were you thinking?
Thanks, Laura. In the summer of 1987, on July the 5th, I started in the position of president and CEO of the Austin Chamber of Commerce, following Lee in that position. And the first day on the job, I was going to a meeting, and down the hallway, this little fella came teetering along, and of course I was sticking my hand out and shaking hands to anybody who listened to me. And he said, "My name is George Kozmetsky." And when he understood who I was, he said, "We need to talk. When this meeting is over, we're going back to your office." So we went back to my office and spent 2 hours talking about Austin and what George's vision was for Austin. George said a lot of things there that were valuable to me and things I wrote down and used later. He said two things that I thought were particularly important. One, he said, Austin needs to become a technopolis, and all of us need to work together to make Austin a technopolis. Well, that was a problem because I didn't know what a technopolis was. So I had to go back to the dictionary and look that one up, and that's a pretty new word for the dictionary at that point in time. And then the other thing he said was, we need to create a technology incubator. Now, I had some exposure to the creation of a technology incubator at Georgia Tech University in Atlanta, so I did know what the subject was all about. I didn't know very much about creating one. But George said, as he teetered out the door that day, he said, "Okay, now, we can make this happen. You get the chamber to put some money in, and get the business community, other business people to support us. I'll get the university to help us. We'll get the city and the county to help us, and we can make this thing happen." Now, it took us a little while to get all that together because the chamber had to raise the money, but indeed it did happen, and what a remarkable thing it has been. The beauty of this, and I know almost all of us out here are going to touch on this, is when I think about ATI, I think about ATI as one of the ingredients of a series of units of infrastructure in support of entrepreneurship that George created. The real brilliance of George, in my opinion, is as we set out at the Chamber with the cooperation of the city and many other leaders to make Austin a technopolis, we started calling on companies in California, and because that's where the technology companies were at that time. And as we did that, George, on the other hand, was back home, and he was putting in place the infrastructure to support entrepreneurship because he had a vision. He could look over the horizon. He knew from his experience in the Silicon Valley that as we began to attract these technology companies, we'd get a critical mass of technology employers and employees, and that we'd begin to see the kind of spin-off that fosters entrepreneurship. And what he wanted to do was know that we had the infrastructure to support that. IC² itself, ATI, a thing called the Capital Network, which was a computerized dating service for investors and entrepreneurs, a thing that we first called, Ray, the Software Council, as you remember, and now is the Austin Technology Council. He had members of the staff at IC² and scholars from the university writing and lecturing around the country and ultimately literally around the world about what was happening in Austin and how this entrepreneurship was going to explode. And indeed, I think all of us up here would agree that this is way more than we ever imagined. George probably realized how significant this would be, but many of us didn't as we followed his lead. So I'd simply say thanks to IC², to all of you who've been involved with IC² over the years for what you've done for the Austin community. And congratulations and happy birthday to the ATI.
Thank you, Glenn. Glenn mentioned funding for the incubator. Ray said I wasn't getting paid. That was absolutely correct. We raised in total $125,000 for each of the first 2 years. We raised a little bit extra from the Travis County when we changed the laws to allow them to invest in economic activities in the third year. And by the end of the third year, ATI had become self-supporting. And so I think having that lesson is really important. But we were self-supporting because of the Chamber, because of the city, because of Travis County, and the business community. Carol, you were an entrepreneur back then. You were also chair of the Chamber.
I did. My family and I arrived in Austin in 1979, and I did not know one person in Austin. But I owned and managed 4 different technology-related companies, and which prepared me to chair the board of the Chamber of Commerce in 1992. I would also say on that board in 1992 was Michael Dell, served on the board at the ripe old age of 26. That was a year that 92 companies visited Austin to talk about relocating, and out of that, 25 of them did expand to Austin. But we were mindful that we also had to take care of the people that were already here in Austin and help those companies that were here expand. So the community, it was overwhelming at Austin Technology Incubator. I can just remember every event that they had in Austin. People were there, wall-to-wall people at the events because it was a new thing. And we didn't have a lot of jobs in Austin early on. So university graduates had to go elsewhere, always yearning to come back to Austin. Early on, we also had the Microcomputer Consortium here, which was a large R&D consortium, the largest in the country. One of the spin-offs from that was a company called ATI, Evolutionary Technologies, and lo and behold, there was 2 females that owned that company. One was Kay Hammer, and she went on to be on the cover of Fortune magazine, one of the few women of the time that was on the cover of Fortune magazine. That company did indeed go from MCC into the Austin Technology Incubator and had a robust life there. I would say now my favorite part of the story is really about George and Ronya. They were a team, and as someone has already said, Ronya was LinkedIn before there was a LinkedIn. The meetings were face-to-face, many of them held at their home. Ronya herself people don't realize, she was a pilot. She managed the RGK Foundation for 30 years. She was an author and wrote a book about management for women, educators, professionals. And she was the warm, gracious side and made sure all of the commitments George made were taken care of. And that was a big job. When George, everybody said how they met George. When I first met him, he said, "I've heard all about you. I just came in from Dublin, and I told the women in Dublin they needed to meet Carol Thompson to connect her with the business and to connect with the business community." So from that, I just want to end saying, you know, today the emphasis on entrepreneurs in Austin and the emphasis on minorities and female entrepreneurs. You know, we've had success. You've heard about the stepping stones so far, but we still have a long way to go, I think, for us to be a total expanding global city. So we still have to make a concerted effort with women and minorities in the city of Austin and around the city so that the next 30 years of ATI can be refreshed with those people in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So
Thank you very much. Listening to my colleagues up here who I had opportunity to work with 30 years ago, I really want to know how I could get in on some of the action of Ray meeting at 5 in the morning and actually Glenn meeting George Kozmetsky at his office, because my meetings with Dr. Kozmetsky were at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I know a few of you had some 4 o'clock meetings too. So, and I wondered where were our fans with George and Ronya on the picture, so the 4 of us, the 5 of us could all put those fans in front of us, because they, not us, were the founders of ATI. But as mayor, I got a call one day, typical George, I'm going to give a speech in Northeast Austin. You've heard the story. He asked me to come over. I said, I don't have time. He said, I'll actually come down and meet you in the parking lot. I met him in the parking lot. Mimi Correa said, you can't stay long. This was a 90-second conversation. I rolled down the window and said, George, what? He said, I need money for the ATI. I need money from the city and the chamber and the county, and I'll put up some money if I can't get it from the university. And I said, okay. And we drove off. That was a 75-second conversation. And that was the beginning of the money, the gas in the gas tank, to put all this together. But it was George, it was George, it was George. But I knew, having run the chamber, and the SRI report that in 1985 said we've got to become a multi-sector economy, that ATI would be a very key part of that ingredient. It was a lot of pieces we had to put together. George was clearly the quarterback. He really understood. Everybody that knew in this room knew that we were his minions. But that ATI study and leading what ATI became. And then after I left the mayor's office, and it was beginning to take off as a city. You talked about it, all of us. But at that time, I went off and started my own. I came out of Texas Instruments. I went back to the private sector, started Medical Polymers Technologies. Jamie was running ATI at the time, and our company stayed in there 3 years. And I guess the best part of it, on a happy birthday to Medical Polymers Technologies, which is now U.S. Medical Systems. I still own it. I'm still shipping product. It's a Class 1 medical device, and we've been in business since 1992. That's the most fun, and I'm telling you, this is very critical to our future. We need ATI, but we also need a medical incubator to take us forward with the University of Texas Medical School. Doctor.
Thank you.
I'll close this off very quickly. Ray said we needed to set expectations, and the expectations of ATI when it was launched was that we would create 200 jobs in 3 years, and in 10 years, we'll be successful, we would fill all of the empty downtown buildings. That was 1 million square feet. You know, in 3 years, We actually created 350 jobs, yet there was no other entity in the US at that time called an incubator that could do even the 200. In 7 years, we filled over 1 million square feet. In the first 2 years, we raised over $70 million for the companies when there was only one venture capitalist in town. We started an angel network, we started the Austin Tech Council as the software council, and many other infrastructure things that were here. But what I really want to tell you is that was the beginning then. And what we have today is a new beginning, because ATI has never stayed the same from any one period to the next. It has evolved, improved, grown. And today, I believe where we are with your help is a new beginning under Mitch Jacobson's leadership for the next phase of ATI and the next phase of what we're going to do in the greater Central Texas community with our partners, the university, with the Chamber of Commerce, with Travis County, and with the city. And together, we can achieve so much. So please, I'm going to ask you, every one of you, and by golly, I'm getting the list of names of you all, that we need you to participate so you too, both your children, yourself, your grandchildren, will have such a profoundly better life going forward than we have today. So join me in congratulating our panel for being here and the founders who kicked things off. Thank you.